They filled my well with concrete. Yes, my private, fully licensed, professionally constructed well, like it was some kind of hazardous waste site threatening their picture-perfect suburban dream. And standing right in the middle of this madness was Sarah Mitchell, the HOA president, clutching her clipboard like a scepter, smirking like she'd just saved the neighborhood from independent thinking. She called it a necessary safety measure. I call it a declaration of war. And I don't lose wars, especially not to someone who turned pettiness into an art form while wearing designer athleisure. If you've ever battled an HOA that thinks it's running the Pentagon, stick around and tell me in the comments what's the most ridiculous thing your HOA has ever done to you. But let me take you back 6 months to show you how this entire nightmare started. I had just relocated to Millbrook Estates after selling my consulting firm, a gorgeous development of 50 homes tucked into the Denver foothills. I purchased my $800,000 house with cash, no financing required, because I wanted a tranquil life where I could focus on my independent engineering consulting. You see, I'm a civil engineer specializing in water management and drainage systems for resorts and high-end developments. After 8 years grinding away at a massive corporation, drowning in pointless meetings and micromanagement, I decided to go solo. Best choice I ever made. I was earning 6 figures working half the hours, designing systems that actually made a difference. The first thing I decided to do was construct the perfect well, not just any well, mind you. This was going to be my engineering showcase, a demonstration of everything I'd learned about sustainable water management. I built that well like a statement of independence, purer than municipal water, stunning as a piece of art. LED lights created this incredible blue glow when night fell, and an automated monitoring system tracked water quality every moment. The granite rim captured sunlight beautifully during the day, and at night it looked like something from a 5-star resort. I had lived in countless places, worked on projects worth millions, but I had never truly owned anything that was completely mine. This well, planned, designed, and installed by my own hands, was the first time I possessed something that belonged entirely to me. It represented everything I cherished: innovation, self-reliance, and doing things properly even when it costs more. Standing beside it with a cold glass of the purest water I'd ever tasted, I felt like I had finally discovered my place in the world. That's when I encountered Sarah Mitchell. She appeared at my door 3 days after I completed the well, carrying a welcome basket filled with gourmet cookies and wearing the kind of flawless makeup and outfit that screamed, "I have nothing better to do than obsess over what my neighbors think." She was 42, recently divorced from some high-powered Denver attorney, and had used her $2.5 million settlement to purchase the most expensive house in our development. What I didn't realize then was that Sarah was accustomed to being the center of attention, the queen bee who organized charity galas and social circles back when she was a trophy wife. Losing that status in a very public, very messy divorce had left her desperately needing to control something, anything, to feel powerful again. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Sarah, your HOA president. I simply had to come see this amazing well everyone's talking about." She walked around it slowly, her expression shifting from curiosity to something that looked uncomfortably like envy. "You're an architect?" she asked, clearly impressed despite herself. "Civil engineer," I replied, pulling up the monitoring app on my phone to show her the real-time water quality data. "I design water systems for resorts and luxury developments. This uses advanced filtration technology. The water coming out is 10 times cleaner than municipal water." I was genuinely excited to share my work with someone, especially a neighbor who seemed interested. But then her expression changed completely. "Oh, that's fascinating," she said, her voice taking on a cooler tone. "You know, here in Millbrook Estates, we really value simplicity, harmony with the community." I felt the first warning bell go off in my head. "Harmony with nature is good," I said. "This is sustainable living at its finest." She gave me that cold smile again. "I meant harmony with the community, Mason. We like things to flow smoothly around here." The way she emphasized smoothly made my skin crawl, but I was still naive enough to think this was just a quirky neighbor who took HOA rules a little too seriously. The granite rim gleamed in the afternoon sun, the LED system created beautiful underwater patterns, and I proudly demonstrated the smartphone app that let me monitor real-time readings of pH, temperature, and purity. My phone displayed every metric like a life monitor for water. But instead of appreciating the innovation, Sarah stood there with her arms crossed, her expression shifting from admiration to something that looked distinctly like jealousy. "Very impressive," she said in a tone that made it clear she didn't mean it as a compliment. "I'm sure all this technology makes you feel quite special." "It's not about feeling special," I said, starting to get defensive. "It's about sustainability and water independence. This system could serve as a model for other homes in the community." That was apparently the wrong thing to say, because her smile became even colder. "Independence," she repeated slowly. "That's an interesting word choice. Here in Millbrook Estates, we believe in interdependence, community standards, working together toward common goals." The way she said independence made it sound like a dirty word. As she left, she turned back with that same frozen smile and said, "Oh, Mason, there's an HOA meeting next week. You should definitely attend." Something about the way she said it made me realize this wasn't a friendly invitation. It was a warning. I watched her walk back to her pristine house, noting how she kept glancing back at my well with an expression I couldn't quite read. Her house was perfect, sterile, exactly like every other house on the block except for the expensive landscaping that probably cost more than most people's cars. If I had known then what I know now, I would have started recording everything from that moment, because Sarah Mitchell was about to turn my peaceful new life into 6 months of absolute hell, all because I had dared to create something beautiful and independent in her perfectly controlled little kingdom. The HOA meeting was held in the community center, a bland beige room that somehow managed to suck all personality out of the air. I showed up expecting the usual boring discussions about landscaping budgets and mailbox maintenance. Instead, I walked into what felt like a carefully orchestrated ambush. Sarah stood at the front of the room with a thick folder of papers, that same cold smile plastered across her face, addressing maybe 20 homeowners who all seemed determined to avoid eye contact with me. "Before we discuss our regular business," she announced, "I'm pleased to present some important new community guidelines that were approved last week." My stomach dropped as she began reading off a list of 15 new regulations. "Before we begin tonight's agenda, I want to announce our new community standards that were just approved." Sarah read each line like she was stabbing my property with words. The lights, the plants, even the well itself, everything was being targeted. Each new rule felt like a personal attack disguised as community improvement, designed specifically to dismantle everything I had built. The room was dead silent except for Sarah's voice, and I realized with growing horror that every single person there knew exactly what was happening. I stood up, trying to keep my voice level and professional. "Excuse me, but I need to object to these retroactive regulations. When I purchased my home and built my well, I followed all existing HOA guidelines and obtained proper permits from the county. Creating new rules specifically to target completed projects seems problematic." I looked around the room hoping for support, but what I saw made my heart sink. An elderly man stared down at his hands, refusing to meet my eyes. A middle-aged woman turned her face away completely. A younger couple suddenly became very interested in studying their phones. I looked around the room again, hoping for even one person to speak up, but the silence was deafening. Not one person defended me. Not one voice questioned the obvious targeting. In that moment, I understood. They didn't support Sarah's actions, but they were more afraid of her than they were outraged by injustice. Sarah's smile grew wider, like a shark sensing blood in the water. "I appreciate your concerns, Mason, but we have to ensure that everything in our community remains safe and appropriate. I'm sure you understand." The way she paused before saying appropriate made it clear that my well was anything but appropriate in her mind. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly bothered by what they were witnessing but too intimidated to speak up. "Safe." I couldn't help but raise my voice slightly. "I'm a licensed civil engineer with full insurance coverage. This is professional-grade work that exceeds all safety standards. My well system is probably safer than the municipal water supply." I pulled out my phone to show the monitoring data, but Sarah waved her hand dismissively. "I don't doubt your expertise," she replied smoothly, "but regulations exist for everyone's benefit. No one gets special treatment, regardless of their professional background." The way she said professional background made it sound like I was some kind of wannabe showing off. "These regulations were created after I completed my project," I pressed, feeling my frustration building. "This is clearly targeting, and frankly, it feels like harassment." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Sarah's facade finally cracked just slightly. Her perfect smile faltered for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Paranoid much, Mason," she said with a little laugh that nobody else joined. "We're simply trying to maintain the beautiful, cohesive community that we've all worked so hard to create. Surely you want to be a good neighbor and work with us, not against us." The implied threat in her words was crystal clear, and I realized I was dealing with someone who had turned HOA management into her personal kingdom. She continued, "What used to be acceptable doesn't always meet our current standards. Communities evolve, Mason, and so must you." She gestured around the room as if she were speaking for everyone present, but I noticed that several residents looked deeply uncomfortable with being included in her royal we. The meeting continued for another hour, covering mundane topics like garbage pickup schedules and holiday decorations, but I couldn't focus on anything except the growing realization that I had somehow made an enemy without even trying. Every time someone raised a question about routine maintenance or community events, Sarah would glance in my direction with that same calculating expression, as if she were already planning her next move against me. After everyone filed out, I approached Sarah directly, hoping that a private conversation might help us find some reasonable middle ground. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. "I just want to live quietly and work on my projects. Can we find some way to work this out?" She gathered her papers slowly, deliberately making me wait for her response like a supplicant seeking an audience with royalty. "Of course we can work it out, Mason," she said finally, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "All you have to do is follow the rules like everyone else. It's really quite simple." "But these rules didn't exist when I built the well," I said, making one final attempt to appeal to basic fairness. "You can't just change the rules retroactively to target one person's property." She looked at me with the kind of condescending expression usually reserved for particularly slow children. "The community evolves, Mason. Our standards have to evolve too. I'm sure a smart engineer like you can figure out how to adapt." The way she said, "adapt," made it clear she meant surrender completely. I left that meeting knowing I was in for a fight, but I still believed that reason and documentation would prevail. After all, I had permits, insurance, professional credentials, and a well that was objectively beneficial to the property and the environment. How wrong I was! When I got home that night, I found the first violation notice taped to my front door. Violation: unauthorized electronic decoration visible from street. Fine: $75 per day until corrected. They were targeting my solar panel, a piece of equipment that was both functional and environmentally responsible. I stared at that bright red notice and realized that Sarah Mitchell wasn't interested in reasonable compromise. She wanted total submission. The war for my independence had officially begun. What followed was the most frustrating month of my adult life. Sarah launched a systematic campaign of harassment disguised as community standards enforcement. Every single day brought a new violation notice, each one more ridiculous than the last. They fined me for towels, tomatoes, trash bins. Every small act was a new violation. Meanwhile, my neighbor's holiday lights stayed up all summer, untouched, not a single notice. The pattern became clear quickly. Sarah was walking through my property with a measuring tape and magnifying glass, looking for any possible violation while completely ignoring identical or worse infractions at other houses. I started documenting everything with photos and timestamps, building a case file that showed the obvious targeting. My neighbor directly across the street had Christmas lights up year-round, which violated at least 3 HOA rules, but somehow never received a single notice. The house next to his had a garden twice the size of mine with vegetables growing right up to the property line, but apparently that was perfectly acceptable. Meanwhile, I was being fined $75 for hanging a single towel to dry and $100 for tomatoes that were technically 6 inches too close to my fence line. By the end of the third week, I had accumulated over $1,200 in fines, all for violations so petty that they would have been ignored at any reasonable property. I tried calling the HOA management company, hoping to speak with someone rational, but was told that all enforcement decisions went through the community president, meaning Sarah had absolute power over my life. I consulted with a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes, but he declined to take my case after receiving a phone call that he described as a conversation with someone who understands the local landscape very well. That's when I realized Sarah's network extended far beyond our little community. As the ex-wife of a prominent Denver lawyer, she had connections throughout the legal and business community. People who might normally challenge obvious harassment were suddenly finding reasons to avoid getting involved. IT was like watching a masterclass in how to abuse a system designed to maintain community standards. Every day brought new creative interpretations of rules that somehow applied only to my property, while Sarah maintained her sweet, concerned neighbor act whenever other residents were around. The breaking point came when I found Mrs. Peterson, my elderly next-door neighbor, slipping a handwritten note into my mailbox late one evening. She looked around nervously before approaching me. "Be careful, dear," she whispered. "She has a plan for your well." I heard her on the phone with someone about environmental concerns and emergency measures. The note she left was even more specific. "She's been researching ways to have your well declared a contamination risk. I think she's found something that will let her force you to shut it down. Please be careful." Mrs. Peterson had lived in the community for 15 years and had never seen anything like Sarah's systematic targeting of a single resident. I started taking Sarah's behavior more seriously and began researching HOA law and property rights in Colorado. What I discovered was both frightening and enlightening. HOA boards had tremendous power to enforce their rules, but they also had legal obligations to treat all residents fairly and to base their decisions on legitimate community interests. Sarah's obvious targeting and retroactive rulemaking could potentially be challenged, but only if I could prove a pattern of harassment and document her real motivations. The problem was that she was smart enough to keep her true agenda hidden behind official-sounding language about community standards and safety concerns. Then I found something that changed everything. While researching municipal water regulations, I stumbled across the city contract that supplied water to our entire community. Buried in the technical language was a clause that caught my attention. Service agreement subject to review and potential suspension in cases of verified environmental violations or community non-compliance with municipal standards. It was a standard legal protection that allowed the city to cut off service if a community was found to be violating environmental regulations or misrepresenting their water usage needs. That's when I realized what Sarah was really planning. If she could manufacture some kind of environmental emergency related to my well, she could not only force me to shut it down but also position herself as the hero who protected the community from a dangerous neighbor. I sat in my home office that night, staring at violation notices scattered across my desk while trying to figure out how to fight back against someone who seemed to hold all the cards. The next morning, I would discover just how far Sarah was willing to go to win her war against my independence. Looking out my window, I could see her house lit up like a Christmas display with landscape lighting that definitely violated the minimal exterior illumination rule she had cited when fining me for my well's LED system. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but what really worried me was the way she kept walking past my property at different times of day, always with that same calculating expression. Mrs. Peterson was right. Sarah was planning something big, and I had a sinking feeling that my beautiful well was about to become ground zero in a battle I wasn't prepared to fight. The violation notices kept coming like clockwork: improper mailbox positioning, unauthorized window coverings, non-approved outdoor furniture arrangement. Each fine was carefully calculated to stay just below the threshold that would trigger automatic legal review, but collectively they were designed to bankrupt me or force me to surrender. I realized that Sarah wasn't just targeting my well, she was trying to make my entire existence in Millbrook Estates so miserable that I would have no choice but to sell my house and move away. But she had made one crucial miscalculation. I was an engineer who understood systems, and I was about to turn her own system against her in ways she never saw coming. I woke up at 6:30 in the morning to the sound of heavy machinery rumbling outside my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was just road construction or utility work, the kind of thing that happens in any neighborhood. But as I became more alert, I realized the noise was coming from my own front yard. I threw on clothes and rushed outside to find 2 concrete trucks parked in my driveway and 3 workers in hard hats standing around my well. My beautiful granite-rimmed well had been wrapped in plastic sheeting and marked with a bright yellow "Danger, Do Not Approach" sign that looked official enough to fool anyone who didn't know better. "What the hell is going on here?" I shouted, running toward the workers who were already setting up their pumping equipment. The crew chief, a weathered man in his 50s, looked genuinely sympathetic as he handed me a clipboard full of official-looking documents. "Sorry, sir, but we have orders from the HOA to perform emergency environmental remediation. This well has been reported as a potential contamination source, and we're required to seal it immediately." My hands were shaking as I scanned the paperwork, seeing phrases like groundwater contamination risk, immediate public health threat, and emergency action authorized by community safety protocols. "This is insane," I said, trying to keep my voice under control. This well is cleaner than city water. I have test results, monitoring data, professional certifications. This is completely fabricated. The crew chief shrugged apologetically. Look, I don't make the decisions. I just follow orders. We've got permits from the county health department and authorization from your HOA board. If you've got a problem with it, you'll need to take it up with them. He gestured toward a county vehicle parked across the street where an official was documenting the remediation process with photographs and forms. I pulled out my phone and started recording everything, knowing that documentation would be crucial if I had any hope of fighting this obvious setup. The workers moved with practiced efficiency, extending the concrete pump's hose and positioning it directly over my well opening. "You can't do this without my permission," I protested. "This is my property." The county official walked over with a clipboard and a badge that made everything seem depressingly legitimate. "Actually, sir, when there's a verified public health emergency, we have authority to take immediate action." The HOA filed a complaint with documented evidence of contamination risk, and our testing confirmed elevated levels of concerning substances. "What testing?" I demanded. "Nobody has tested my water except me, and I have documentation showing it exceeds all safety standards." The official looked uncomfortable but stuck to his script. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have to err on the side of public safety. You can request a hearing to contest the findings, but the remediation has to proceed immediately." I realized with growing horror that Sarah had somehow manufactured fake test results and convinced county officials that my well posed a genuine threat. The whole thing was a masterpiece of bureaucratic manipulation, using official channels to accomplish what amounted to pure vandalism. The concrete trucks fired up their pumps, and I watched helplessly as they began filling my engineering masterpiece with liquid cement. 25 feet of carefully planned depth disappearing under an avalanche of gray concrete that would harden into permanent destruction. I kept recording, capturing every moment of the process while trying to argue with officials who seemed genuinely convinced they were protecting public safety. The whole operation took less than 2 hours, transforming my beautiful, functional well into an ugly concrete monument to Sarah's ruthlessness. And then, just as the last of the concrete was being poured, Sarah herself appeared, walking across my lawn with that same sweet smile she had worn during our first meeting. "Oh, Mason, I'm so sorry about all this," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I know how proud you were of your little project, but sometimes we have to make sacrifices for the greater good." I was so angry I could barely speak, but I managed to keep recording as she continued her performance. "I hope you understand that we couldn't risk contaminating the groundwater for the entire neighborhood. I'm sure you'll appreciate having clean, safe city water like the rest of us." "You fabricated this entire emergency," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "You know as well as I do that my well was perfectly safe. This is harassment, pure and simple." Sarah's mask slipped just slightly, revealing a flash of the cold calculation underneath her neighborly facade. "That's a very serious accusation, Mason. I hope you're not suggesting that county health officials would participate in some kind of conspiracy. That sounds almost paranoid." She emphasized the word paranoid the same way she had during the HOA meeting, like she was diagnosing a mental illness. "What I'm suggesting," I replied, still recording, "is that you've made the biggest mistake of your life." She laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Mistake? I think I've solved a problem that was making everyone in the neighborhood uncomfortable. Now you can join the rest of civilized society and use municipal water like a normal person." The county official and concrete crew were packing up their equipment, leaving behind a yard that looked like a construction zone and a concrete plug where my pride and joy had been just hours before. That night, I sat in my home office staring at the footage I had captured, watching Sarah's performance over and over again. Her words kept echoing in my mind, "Now you can join the rest of civilized society." She thought she had won, that she had broken my spirit and forced me into submission like any other troublesome resident. But Sarah Mitchell had made one crucial miscalculation. She had targeted an engineer who understood exactly how systems worked, including the system that kept her perfect little community supplied with water. As I started researching municipal water contracts and environmental compliance regulations, I began to see the outline of a plan that would give her a taste of her own medicine. The next few days were a blur of research, phone calls, and careful planning. I knew that Sarah had used fake environmental concerns to destroy my well, which meant she had filed false reports with county officials and potentially committed fraud in the process. But more importantly, I realized that her fabricated contamination emergency might be the key to turning the tables on her entire operation. I spent hours digging through municipal records and city contracts, looking for any leverage I could use against someone who seemed to control every official channel in our community. That's when I found the golden ticket buried in the fine print of Millbrook Estates' water service agreement with Denver. Buried in the fine print was a golden bomb, one fake pollution claim, and the city could pull the plug, not maybe, instantly. It was designed to protect the city from liability if a community was found to be misrepresenting environmental conditions or filing fraudulent safety reports. Sarah's fake contamination report wasn't just harassment. It was exactly the kind of false environmental reporting that could trigger a service suspension. I realized I needed to be strategic about this. Going to the authorities with accusations of harassment would be my word against hers, and she had already proven her ability to manipulate official channels. But if I could get her to admit on record that she had fabricated the contamination report, I would have concrete evidence of fraud that the city couldn't ignore. I needed to make her feel safe enough to brag about her victory, confident enough to reveal how she had pulled off her master plan. The challenge was creating a situation where she would incriminate herself without realizing she was being recorded. I decided to invite her over for what I called a peace negotiation. I sent her a text message saying that I was ready to discuss reasonable compromises and that I hoped we could find a way to move forward as good neighbors. Her response came back within minutes. "Of course, Mason. I've always believed that reasonable people can work things out. How about tomorrow afternoon in your backyard?" The speed of her reply and the exclamation points told me everything I needed to know. She was eager to celebrate her victory and probably curious about how thoroughly she had broken my spirit. I spent that evening carefully setting up recording equipment around my patio area. I positioned a small camera inside a decorative planter and placed a backup audio recorder inside my outdoor speaker system. I wanted multiple angles and redundant recording in case something went wrong with the technology. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about documentation and justice. Sarah had used the system to destroy my property through fraud and manipulation, and I was going to use the same system to hold her accountable. The next afternoon, she arrived right on time, wearing a flowing sundress and carrying a bottle of expensive wine like we were old friends getting together for a social visit. "Mason," she said warmly, giving me an air kiss like we hadn't been engaged in psychological warfare for months, "I'm so glad you reached out. I've been hoping we could put all this unpleasantness behind us." She settled into one of my patio chairs, looking completely relaxed and confident, like a general surveying a conquered battlefield. "I have to admit," I said, playing my part carefully, "you really outmaneuvered me with the whole environmental thing. I never saw that coming." Her eyes lit up with genuine pleasure at the compliment. "Well, sometimes you have to think creatively when dealing with difficult situations. I've learned that people respond better to official authority than to simple requests." She poured herself a glass of wine and settled back in her chair, clearly enjoying the opportunity to explain her brilliance to the defeated enemy. "How did you even know to use environmental concerns?" I asked, trying to sound like an impressed student learning from a master. "I mean, that was incredibly effective." Sarah practically preened at the praise. "Oh, Mason, you'd be amazed what you can accomplish when you understand how these systems work. I've been involved in community management for years, and I've learned that environmental safety is the one thing that makes officials act immediately, no questions asked." She took a sip of wine and continued, "All it took was one phone call to a friend who understands how to write convincing reports." "A friend?" I prompted, trying to keep my voice casual while my heart pounded with excitement. "That's genius. So the contamination report was—" She waved her hand dismissively. $500 to someone who knows how to make things sound official and scary. Worth every penny for the results. She gestured toward the concrete plug where my well used to be. "Sometimes you have to invest in solutions, And honestly, the whole thing was probably illegal anyway. Private wells in established communities always create complications." I could barely contain my excitement as she continued digging her own grave. "The best part," she said, warming to her subject, "is that everyone thinks I'm the hero who protected the neighborhood from a dangerous situation. They have no idea how easy it was to manufacture the whole crisis." She laughed, clearly delighted with her own cleverness. I mean, you had to know that having your own water source made everyone else feel inadequate, like you were showing off or something. Nobody wants to live next to someone who thinks they're better than the rest of us. So this was really about the well making me stand out too much? I asked, giving her the opportunity to fully incriminate herself. Oh, absolutely, she replied without hesitation. If I let one person have their own private water source, pretty soon everyone would want one. Then who would pay for the municipal water system? The whole community structure would fall apart. I had to nip that in the bud before it became a trend. She raised her wineglass in a mock toast to community standards and the people who enforced them. As she left that afternoon, still glowing with satisfaction from her confession, I sat on my patio reviewing the perfect footage I had captured. Sarah had just handed me everything I needed to destroy her credibility and potentially face criminal charges for filing false reports. But more importantly, she had given me the leverage to turn her own weapon against her. That evening, I made a phone call to the Denver Water Department and asked to speak with someone about reporting a serious violation of their service contract. I need to report fraudulent environmental claims that may have compromised the integrity of your community service agreements, I told the supervisor. And I have video evidence to support my claims. Within 48 hours of my call to the Water Department, everything changed. I had submitted Sarah's recorded confession along with a detailed written complaint documenting the pattern of harassment and fraudulent reporting. The city took false environmental claims very seriously, especially when they involved manipulating county health officials and potentially exposing the municipality to liability. By Thursday morning, every house in Millbrook Estates received an official notice. Water service temporarily suspended. Pending investigation of contract violations and false reporting. Estimated restoration. Pending resolution of investigation. The first phone call came at 7:15 in the morning. Then another at 7:20. By 8 o'clock, my phone was ringing non-stop with panicked neighbors demanding to know what was happening and why they suddenly had no water for showers, coffee, or basic daily needs. The beautiful thing was that I had nothing to do with the decision. I had simply reported documented fraud to the appropriate authorities and let the system work exactly as it was designed. Sarah had weaponized environmental regulations against me, and now those same regulations were being used to hold the entire community accountable for her deception. The emergency HOA meeting was called for that evening, and the community center was packed with angry, unwashed residents who had spent the day dealing with the reality of life without running water. I arrived early and set up my laptop and portable projector, knowing that this would be my one chance to present the evidence clearly and completely. The mood in the room was electric with frustration and confusion, with most people still unclear about exactly what had triggered the water shutdown. Sarah sat in the front row, looking pale and shaken but still trying to maintain her composure and authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice slightly strained, "we're dealing with an unfortunate situation that appears to be the result of a misunderstanding with the city water department. I'm confident we can resolve this quickly once we clarify a few administrative details." She was trying to frame the crisis as a bureaucratic mix-up, something that could be smoothed over with the right phone calls and explanations. But I could see the panic in her eyes as she realized that her carefully constructed world was starting to collapse. I stood up and walked to the front of the room, feeling dozens of frustrated eyes following my movement. "Actually, there's no misunderstanding," I said, connecting my laptop to the projector. "The water was shut off because the city discovered that false environmental reports were filed against my property, which constitutes fraud and violates the community's service contract." A murmur went through the crowd as people began to understand that this wasn't a simple administrative error. "What I'm about to show you," I continued, "is video footage of our HOA president admitting that she paid $500 for a fabricated contamination report that she used to destroy my well and manipulate county officials." The room went dead silent as I started the video, and Sarah's voice filled the space. $500 to someone who knows how to make things sound official and scary. Worth every penny for the results. You could have heard a pin drop as the recording continued, capturing her casual admission of fraud and her satisfaction at manufacturing a crisis that endangered the entire community's water supply. When the video finished, the room erupted. People were shouting questions, demanding explanations, and expressing outrage at being dragged into Sarah's personal vendetta. "You lied to all of us," shouted one neighbor. "My kids couldn't take baths last night because of your fake emergency," yelled another. Mrs. Peterson stood up, her voice shaking with anger. "You made us all accomplices to your harassment campaign. We trusted you to protect our community, and instead you put everyone at risk." Sarah tried desperately to maintain control, standing up and raising her hands for quiet. "Now let's all calm down and think about this rationally," she said, but her voice was trembling and her usual authority had completely evaporated. "Mason has obviously edited this recording to make it sound worse than it was. We can't base important decisions on potentially manipulated evidence." But the crowd wasn't buying her denials, especially when I played the recording a second time, showing the unedited footage with timestamps and metadata clearly visible. "I move that we vote immediately to remove Sarah Mitchell as HOA president," called out one homeowner. "Second," came voices from around the room. The vote was swift and decisive, 48 in favor of removal, with only Sarah voting against her own removal. She sat alone in the front row as the community she had terrorized turned completely against her, finally understanding the extent of her deception and manipulation. But the community also realized they needed immediate action to restore their water service. "Mason," said Mrs. Peterson, "you understand these systems better than any of us. Can you help us fix this mess?" I had anticipated this request and already prepared a detailed action plan. "I've already contacted the water department and provided them with evidence that the false reports came from one individual acting without community authorization," I explained. Subscribe AS Stories. Tell me in comment section if you want to hear the last part of the story.